Fierce, ruthless, and above all, unwaveringly loyal. The fame of the northern warriors echoed throughout Europe, but it was in an unlikely place that their legend became immortal. In a Byzantine court saturated with betrayal and intrigue, the Emperor of Byzantium sought a solution none of his local generals could offer: the strength of men without political ties or ambitions for the throne, whose oath was worth more than gold. Thus was born the Varangian Guard, an elite group of barbarians who, counterintuitively, became the last and only hope of a millennia-old empire. Life in their homelands was brutal, offering little glory and less wealth. But the legend of Miklagard, a city of gold and opulence, promised swift reward for those who exchanged the chaos of plunder for the discipline of service. Prepare to discover how these men, wielders of feared axes, forged the loyalty that defended the richest throne in the world. Their saga is proof that honor and service can build a legacy greater than conquest. If you believe that history is an inexhaustible source of incredible sagas, your support is essential. Like this story so it reaches more people, and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss out on future discoveries. This helps us continue to spread knowledge to even more people. Comment where you're watching from and tell us what other stories you'd like to see here. The air in 10th century Scandinavia was a constant invitation to harshness. The land, sculpted by wind and ice, offered little more than arduous sustenance. For a warrior, life in his village was a monotonous succession of gray days. Dawn brought toil in the fields or fishing in icy waters, and dusk brought darkness and tales of war and plunder that seemed ever more distant. The family heritage of a well-forged axe and a long tradition of honor in combat no longer found the stage they deserved. The calm, however, was a double-edged sword. While it brought a precarious peace, it also fueled despair and ambition, and it was in this stagnation that whispers began to spread, carried by the wind and the sails of the few traders who dared venture along the eastern river routes. They spoke of a magical, distant, and legendary place. They called it Miklagard, the great city. The tales were almost unbelievable. Marble-paved streets, churches with domes that touched the sky, and walls so vast that an entire army could not besiege them. The traders spoke not of plunder and terror, but of a new form of fortune: service. It was said that the Emperor of Miklagard, a ruler who wielded unimaginable power and wealth, was always in search of elite warriors. The reward? Not just silver or gold, but a regular and generous salary that would make a man rich for life. For warriors eager to prove their worth, this was not just a legend, but a promise. It was a stark contrast to the life of a simple raider. Instead of a single risky expedition, Miklagard's promise was a career. You could become part of an elite force, serving the richest and most powerful monarch known. The challenge was not just defeating an enemy in open field, but resisting temptation, the discipline of a professional army, and loyalty to a man who spoke a strange language and worshipped a different god. It was a daunting prospect, but for a man who saw his future tied to the cold, barren land of his homeland, the prospect of a journey south toward the sun and gold was irresistible. The ships would no longer carry just men in search of plunder, but warriors in search of a new destiny, a life that existed only in whispered tales. It was the promise of a new kind of saga, one that wouldn't end in battle and death, but in wealth, honor, and perhaps a new legend to be told. If this story surprised you, leave a like so more people can discover it. The decision to set out for Miklagard was only the first step on a journey that would test any warrior's soul and body. For the Norse, the route south was as perilous as the fiercest battle. They did not sail the open sea, but followed the intricate and treacherous river network of Eastern Europe, a route that would become known as the Varangian Way. The journey began in the Baltic Sea, where long, lighter, river-adapted ships began to infiltrate the great river systems. The Dnieper, the Volga, and other smaller rivers were the arteries of this great route. But unlike the calm, cold waters of the fjords, these rivers presented unique challenges. The rapids were the first and most brutal obstacle. The rivers, in certain seasons, transformed into turbulent streams, with sharp rocks and treacherous waterfalls. The boats had to be dragged by hand by exhausted men for long distances, a process known as portage. Under the scorching sun, they pushed and pulled the heavy vessels, their muscles burning and their minds focused solely on not losing the fragile boat and all its contents. The danger didn't come only from nature. Along the banks lurked bands of Slavic and Turkic peoples who saw the Varangians as easy prey. They sought not only to plunder but also to enslave the weary warriors, turning an adventurous journey into a nightmare of servitude. The Varangians, with their axes and shields, had to be constantly vigilant, their hand always ready for the hilt of their swords, even when fatigue seemed unbearable. The vast expanse of unknown lands was an enemy in itself. At each turn of the river, a new landscape unfolded. Vast steppes inhabited by nomadic horsemen, dense forests hiding unknown dangers, and villages of people with languages and customs they had never seen before. Disorientation was constant, and the only means of navigation was accumulated experience and the legends passed down by those who had already traveled the route. The journey took months, sometimes years, depending on the challenges and the necessary stops for trade or resupply. Many perished along the way, victims of disease, the brutal climate, or ambushes. The route was a sieve. Only the strongest, most resilient, and luckiest reached their destination. It was this natural selection that ensured that only the cream of the northern warriors would reach the splendor and opulence of Guard, ready to become the legendary Varangian Guard. After months of an exhausting journey, marked by the monotony of rivers, the fear of ambushes, and the constant struggle against nature, the end of the journey for the warriors was an event that transcended mere arrival. It was a shock to the senses, a spectacle that seemed to have come from legend. The first sight of the walls of Constantinople, or Guard, was enough to silence even the proudest of warriors. They were no simple wooden palisades, but massive, triple-stone fortifications that seemed to stretch into infinity, protecting the city from any threat. They were vaster and more imposing than anything they had ever seen. The security they conveyed was as monumental as their scale. Once inside the city, the Norsemen's known world was turned upside down. The city was not just large, it was a labyrinth of opulence and life. The air carried the aromas of spices they had never smelled before, mingled with the salty smell of the sea. For the first time in their lives, they saw people from all over the world. Merchants from Africa, traders from Asia, pilgrims from Western countries. It was a profusion of languages, colors, and costumes that contrasted sharply with the monochromatic simplicity of their homeland. Luxury was openly displayed, from the gold-embroidered silk fabrics to the jewelry adorning the elite, a world utterly different from the subsistence economy of their homeland. But nothing compared to the sight of Hagia Sophia, the Church of Saint Sophia. Tales of a dome seemingly suspended by a golden chain didn't do justice to reality. Entering the basilica, the warriors felt overwhelmed by the immensity of the space. Light filtering through the high windows illuminated the shimmering gold mosaics and vast marble surfaces. The air resounded with the singing of hymns in a language they didn't understand, but whose beauty and solemnity touched them deeply. For a warrior accustomed to rustic wooden shrines and sacrifices in clearings, the experience was almost mystical. They and their companions, men of war and blood, stood in silence, unsure how to process the magnitude of this place. The shock was not just cultural, it was existential. They had arrived at the end of the known world, in a place that seemed at once a paradise and a realm of magic. To become part of it, they would have to leave behind everything that defined them, except perhaps their strength and loyalty. If you're enjoying this journey, hit the bell so you don't miss the next chapters of this epic story. Their initial fascination and awe of Constantinople quickly gave way to the harsh reality of the mission that had brought them there. The city's opulence was alluring, but the promise of joining the Varangian Guard was not for everyone. The recruitment process was a rigorous ordeal, a ruthless sieve designed to select only the best. The Byzantine officers in charge of the selection, experienced and skeptical men, regarded the newcomers with a mixture of curiosity and distrust. They saw a group of tall, bearded men, dirty from the road, but they knew that beneath the rough exterior lay a strength and discipline rarely found in common mercenaries. The initial test was a display of sheer strength. Warriors were made to lift enormous weights, demonstrating their ability to carry heavy armor and march long distances. Physical strength was not only a prerequisite, but a matter of life and death in battle. Next came the test with the weapon that would become the Guard's trademark, the axe. They were judged on their skill in wielding the Danish axe, a long-handled, broad-bladed weapon that required considerable strength and refined technique. Dexterity wasn't just for attack. The Byzantines were interested in the speed and precision with which warriors could defend and counterattack. But the most crucial test, the one that separated the warriors from the elite, was the endurance test. They were forced to march under the scorching sun, in forced marches, in full armor and battle gear. The ordeal was not just physical, it was psychological. The Byzantine officers shouted orders in a language they didn't understand, trying to break their concentration and discipline. It was a test to see who would break, who would falter, and who would bear the weight of duty, even under pressure and exhaustion. It was a clear demonstration that life in the Guard would not be one of luxury and ease, but rather of sacrifice and iron discipline. The few who passed each test were separated from the pack, ready for the final stage, the oath. They had proven their worth, but now they would have to prove their loyalty, a concept that to them was as valuable as gold itself. The Civ had been cruel, but the men who emerged on the other side were true wolves ready to serve the Emperor. The trial by fire had filtered the group, leaving only the fittest. But martial skill alone was not enough to join the Varangian Guard. The true rite of passage was the sacred oath. For the Byzantines, loyalty was a commodity more rare and valuable than gold. The imperial court was a hotbed of intrigue, betrayal, and conspiracies, where even the most trusted local guards could be bought or turned. That's why they sought out foreigners, men with no family or political ties to the capital, whose loyalty would be unquestionable. The oath was a solemn ceremony, performed within the walls of the imperial palace, a place of luxury and power the northern warriors could barely fathom. The warriors who had passed the tests were led to a courtyard, where they were received by a high-ranking official and an Orthodox priest. The official, with the help of a translator, explained the nature of the commitment they were about to make. Their loyalty was not only to the emperor, but to the empire, to the throne, and to the city of Constantinople itself. It was an oath that required them to place their lord above all others, above their family, their clan, and their ancestral gods. The sacred oath was a ritual that blended Norse tradition with Byzantine pomp. They swore not to betray the emperor, not to conspire against him, and not to raise a hand against his guards, even if their own lives were at risk. They were to serve until death, or until honorably discharged, something few achieved. In return, the emperor guaranteed them not only a lavish salary but also an honored position at court. They would be his eyes and ears, his elite force, and would be feared and respected by all. The oath was an act of renunciation and acceptance. They renounced their identity as free warriors of the North to accept the life of loyal guard dogs, bound by gold and honor to a distant sovereign. They knelt and kissed the emperor's hand, a gesture of submission they would never have made in their homeland. And when they rose, they were no longer just warriors of the North. They were Varangians, members of the Guard, the emperor's watchdogs ready to fulfill their oath. The axe has always been the soul of a Norse warrior, but in Constantinople, it took on a new life, a new form of terror. The Danish axe was no ordinary weapon. It was a lethal work of art, a combat tool that the Varangians honed to a level of mastery that terrified the empire's enemies. It had a long handle, over 5 feet long, allowing the warrior to strike from a distance with a curved, wide blade capable of cutting a man in half with a single blow. It was not just a weapon of war, it was a statement of power and intent. The Varangian Guard adopted the Danish axe as their primary weapon, and with it, it became the symbol of their identity. While other Byzantine soldiers used spears and swords, the Varangians stood out. Wherever they stood, the sharp silver blades of their axes were visible, a constant reminder of their presence and lethality. The sound of the axe cutting through the air, or the sight of a line of warriors with their blades glinting in the sun, was enough to sow panic in the enemy ranks. It was not the number of men, but the quality of their strength and the ferocity of their attack that defined the Guard. For a Varangian, his axe was more than a weapon. It was an extension of his own strength, a part of his identity. He trained daily, sharpened it carefully, and carried it with pride. The weapon, once used for chopping wood and hunting in his homeland, was now a tool of war, a sword of justice and punishment. The axe was not only a weapon of terror but also a status symbol. The axe's handle was made of high-quality wood, and the blade was adorned with symbols and runes, a reflection of its wielder's status. The axes of the Varangian Guard were coveted by other soldiers and nobles, but the emperor prohibited the possession of such weapons by anyone other than a Varangian. The legend of the Danish axe grew with the Guard's fame. The weapon became the embodiment of the Varangian Guard's strength and terror, and its sound became the symphony of death for the empire's enemies. Far from their homelands, amidst a people and culture that were foreign to them, the Varangians found solace and strength in one another. Within the walls of the imperial palace, they formed a brotherhood of barbarians, a cohesive and resilient subculture. They shared a past, a language, and a heritage that united them in a way the Byzantines could never understand. Together, they created a haven of familiarity in a world of strangeness. Nights at the guard barracks were full of life. Around campfires, warriors gathered to share stories, sing songs from their homeland, and drink mead and wine they made or bought themselves. They created their own sagas, telling the tales of their journeys to Miklagard, the battles they fought in, and the legends they were creating. These stories were a way to maintain their identity, to remember who they were and where they came from. They called each other brothers, a term that had a deeper meaning than simple kinship. They were a family, a unit, and loyalty to each other was as important as loyalty to the emperor. Isolation and exclusion from Byzantine society actually served to strengthen their brotherhood. They were viewed with a mixture of admiration and contempt by the locals, but the Guard cared little. They had their own code of honor, their own rules, and their own rituals. The celebration of important dates, such as the solstices and Nordic festivals, continued within the palace walls. They adapted their traditions and beliefs, blending them with Byzantine culture, but the essence of their identity remained intact. This brotherhood was the foundation of their strength and effectiveness in combat. They fought as a single unit, as if they were one body. In battle, they trusted each other with their lives. The individual strength of each warrior was immense, but the collective strength of their brotherhood was unstoppable. It was proof that even in a world of luxury and opulence, a northern warrior's true wealth lay in the bonds of loyalty and camaraderie he forged with his brothers. For the Byzantine emperor, who sought loyalty through gold, the greatest reward he had achieved was a brotherhood of warriors who fought not just for their pay, but for honor and for their brothers. The life of a Varangian was not an uninterrupted succession of battles and glory. In fact, much of their time was consumed by a routine of boredom and discipline, a stark contrast to the life of adventure they had envisioned. A guard's daily routine was a constant alternation between brutal training and long hours of static guard duty. In the mornings, the warriors underwent a grueling training regimen designed to keep them in peak physical and mental shape. They practiced axe fighting, shield formation, and phalanx advanced tactics. The drills were more than exercises. They were war simulations, where blows were real, injuries were common, and discipline was forged in pain. The hardest part, however, was the boredom. The long hours on guard duty were an ordeal in themselves. A Varangian's discipline was tested to the extreme, as they stood motionless in the sun or rain, at the gates of the imperial palace or in the emperor's chambers. It was monotonous work, where the only activity was constant vigilance. It tested the mind and patience of men who had spent their lives on the move, seeking adventure and combat. The monotony was broken only by the stream of nobles, merchants, and officials passing by, all of whom the Varangians regarded with a mixture of contempt and indifference. Discipline was key to survival. They were forbidden to speak, to move, to express any emotion. They were, in effect, statues of terror, a silent and imposing demonstration of the emperor's power. The brutal training and the boredom of the guard were two sides of the same coin. Training prepared them for action, and boredom prepared them for inaction, for patience, for self-control. It was this contrast that made the Varangian Guard an elite force. They were not just warriors. They were soldiers, disciplined, controlled, and ready to act in an instant, at any moment. This regime of training and boredom was the forging of a new mentality. They learned to be patient, to observe, to listen. They learned to move silently, to communicate with gestures, and to obey orders without question. It was a radical change for men who had grown up in a culture of individualism and freedom. But it was this discipline that made them invaluable to the emperor. He could trust them with his life because he knew they would not bow to corruption or intrigue, but rather to discipline and the oath they had sworn. The discipline and tedium of palace life dissipated on their nights off, when the rigid routine gave way to a frantic pursuit of pleasure and excess. The taverns of Constantinople became the Varangians' refuge, a place where they could be themselves, far from the surveillance of the emperor and the court. With their generous pay, the northern warriors lived a life of luxury they could never dream of in their homelands. They spent their gold on wine, gambling, and the company of women, seeking in vice the adrenaline that monotonous palace life denied them. The taverns were a battlefield in themselves. The mixture of alcohol, money, and the Varangian culture, with its pride and impetuous nature, led to inevitable fights with local soldiers. The rivalry between the Varangians and the Byzantine troops was a constant, simmering tension that erupted into violence at any moment. The Byzantine soldiers viewed the Varangians with a mixture of envy and contempt. They called them barbarians and accused them of stealing their jobs and their women. The Varangians, in turn, saw them as weak and corrupt, men without honor or courage. These fights were more than simple altercations. They were clashes of cultures, values, and pride. The Varangians fought with the same ferocity they used in combat, and taverns became battlefields. Byzantine justice was swift to punish violence, but the emperor, who depended on the loyalty and strength of the guard, turned a blind eye to transgressions as long as they did not threaten public order. Tavern life was, in fact, a form of escape, a pressure valve for the discipline and tedium they led in the palace. It was a place where they could feel free, where they could be proud of who they were and where they came from. It was the contrast between discipline and savagery that made them unique. Life in the Varangian Guard was not only about gold and glory, it was also about vice and violence, a mixture that made them feared and respected by all. It was proof that, even in a world of luxury and civilization, the heart of a northern warrior still beat with the same fury and desire for adventure that had brought them there. The legend of the Varangians was based not only on their discipline and loyalty, but on a fighting force that seemed supernatural. In moments of great stress, some warriors would enter a state of combat ecstasy, an uncontrollable rage that turned them into a force of nature, known as berserker gang. To the Byzantines, it was a terrifying phenomenon, a mystery they could not explain. The rage was both a blessing and a curse. It made them invincible, but also plunged them into a state of temporary madness, where they felt neither pain nor fear. The first time a Varangian went berserker gang in combat was a moment of terror for his enemies and awe for his comrades. The warrior, wide-eyed and uncontrollably furious, threw himself into battle, heedless of his own safety. He fought like a wild animal, with the strength of a bear and the ferocity of a wolf. Enemies fled in panic at the sight of a man who seemed not to be flesh and blood, but fury and death. The sound of the axe slicing through the air and the war cries erupting from the warrior's throat were enough to break the morale of any army. The berserker gang was a legend, but its reality was undeniable. Although there is no concrete historical evidence proving the berserker gang's existence, there are accounts of its ferocity in combat. The emperor, a man of faith, saw the Varangians' fury as a manifestation of God's grace, a divine blessing that gave them the strength to fight and win. The Varangians, in turn, saw their fury as an inheritance from their ancestral gods, proof of their superiority in combat. The berserker gang was a symbol of their identity, their connection to the land of their ancestors, and their barbaric nature. The fury of a Varangian in battle was a spectacle. It was proof that, even in a world of rules and civilization, the spirit of the North still existed. Fury was a tool, a secret weapon the emperor used to terrorize his enemies. It was proof that the Varangian Guard was not only made of gold and honor, it was also made of blood and terror. Fury was the essence of their strength, the the strength that made them the most feared and respected unit in the entire Byzantine Empire. I hope you enjoyed this part of the story. If so, please like, subscribe to the channel, and activate the bell so you don't miss future installments. This helps spread knowledge about this fascinating story and reach more people interested in history. And tell us where you're watching from. Do you have any story suggestions you'd like to see here? Leave a comment. While the Varangian Guard lived in a world of discipline and vice, the Byzantine Empire, which they swore to protect, was immersed in a profound crisis of political instability. The imperial court was a cauldron of intrigue, where ambitious generals and corrupt nobles constantly conspired to overthrow the emperor and assume the throne. The history of the empire was a succession of coups, assassinations, and betrayals, a landscape of uncertainty that undermined the emperor's authority and threatened the very existence of the state. The biggest problem was the lack of loyalty. The Byzantine generals, who were the backbone of the army, frequently rebelled against the emperor. They used their troops and influence to amass power and wealth, and they didn't hesitate to betray their lord to achieve their goals. The palace guard, which was supposed to be the emperor's last line of defense, was equally corrupt and unreliable. Its members, who were wealthy and influential men, could be bought with money or promises of power. They were more loyal to their own interests than to the emperor, and the throne was constantly threatened from within. It was against this backdrop of betrayal and corruption that Emperor Basil II, known as the Bulgaroktonos or Bulgar Killer, realized the need for an elite force immune to court intrigue. He needed men with no family or political ties to the capital, who could not be bought or bribed. He needed men whose loyalty was unquestionable, and that was how the figure of the Northern warrior became so attractive to him. The Norse, with their reputation for strength, honor, and loyalty, were the perfect solution to his problem. They cared nothing for court intrigue, power struggles, or the riches of the nobles. They cared only for gold and honor, and the emperor could give them both. The empire in crisis was a constant reminder of the fragility of power. The Varangian Guard was, in fact, a radical solution to an age-old problem. They were the emperor's watchdogs, the only force he could truly trust. The irony was that to maintain the empire's stability, the emperor needed to surround himself with barbarians, men who came from distant lands and who had nothing in common with Byzantine culture except the loyalty they swore to him. Emperor Basil II's decision to recruit warriors from the north was formalized in one of the most remarkable agreements in Byzantine history. In 987, the empire was in a desperate situation, with two internal rebellions threatening the throne. Basil, in an act of desperation and cunning, sought help from Vladimir I the Great, Prince of Kiev. Vladimir, who had unified the Kievan Rus, was a powerful and ambitious leader, but also a pagan, seeking an alliance with a Christian empire. The agreement was an extraordinary exchange. Vladimir promised to send 6,000 elite warriors to help Basil crush the rebellions. In exchange, the emperor offered the hand of his sister, Princess Anna Porphyrogenita, in marriage. For Vladimir, marriage to a Byzantine princess was a recognition of his sovereignty and an opportunity to connect with the imperial family, the most powerful and wealthy in the world. But the agreement had one condition: Vladimir and his people must convert to Orthodox Christianity. The baptism of an entire people was the price of the alliance. The arrival of the 6,000 warriors was a turning point for Basil. His strength, weakened by the rebellions, was bolstered by an army of fierce and loyal men. They crushed the rebellions, restored order, and became the foundation of the Varangian Guard. For Vladimir, the agreement was a success. He married Princess Anna, converted to Christianity, and established a lasting alliance with the Byzantine Empire. The conversion of the Rus to Orthodox Christianity was one of the most important events in European history, and it was largely the result of a political and military agreement. The Basil II Agreement was the official birth of the Varangian Guard. It transformed a mercenary unit into an elite force, with a status and recognition few foreign armies had ever achieved. The agreement exemplified how politics and diplomacy could be used to solve problems that military force alone could not. The exchange of warriors for an imperial bride was an unprecedented transaction, an act of pragmatism that changed the course of history and gave the Varangian Guard its place in history. The arrival of the 6,000 warriors, guaranteed by the agreement with Vladimir of Kiev, marked the beginning of a new era for the emperor's security. The newly arrived mercenaries soon had their baptism of fire, the Varangian Guard's first major battle as a cohesive unit. Their challenge was the traitorous general Bardas Phocas, who had proclaimed himself emperor and was leading a vast rebellion against Basil II. Phocas's forces were numerous and experienced, but the loyalty of his men was questionable. Basil, in an act of boldness, decided to face the rebel in a decisive battle. The battle took place in 988 near Chrysopolis, on the Asian side of the Bosphorus. Basil's tactic was simple but effective. Use the Varangians' brute strength as a spear, piercing the heart of Phocas's army. The Varangians, with their Danish axes in hand, advanced as a single unit, a wall of steel and fury. Their ferocity and discipline in combat were a strength the rebels had not expected. The leader of the Varangian Guard, the Varangian Starakios, commanded his men masterfully, and they fought with a fury that terrified their enemies. The decisive moment of the battle was the confrontation between Basil II and Bardas Phocas. The Varangians, in an act of unquestioning loyalty, rushed to protect their emperor. "Protect the emperor! For the throne! For the honor! For the oath!" shouted Starakios. They formed a circle of shields around Basil and fought with a ferocity that surpassed the fury of the rebels. The battle was short and brutal, and the result was a decisive victory for Basil. Phocas was killed in combat, and his rebellion was crushed. The Varangian Guard's baptism of fire was a resounding success. They proved their valor, their strength, and above all, their unwavering loyalty to the emperor. Emperor Basil II saw in his new guards the solution to the problem of treason and corruption that plagued the empire. He rewarded the guard with honors and pay, and the Varangians became his elite unit, his shock force, his last line of defense. The Battle of Chrysopolis was the turning point for the Varangian Guard, the moment they became a living legend, the most feared and respected force in the entire Byzantine Empire. With their unwavering loyalty proven in their baptism of fire, the Varangian Guard assumed their most critical role, that of the emperor's personal bodyguard. They went from being merely a combat unit to becoming the monarch's shadow, a constant and imposing presence that accompanied him everywhere, at all hours of the day. Emperor Basil II, who had been betrayed by his own generals and guards, now entrusted his life to the Varangians, the foreigners who had nothing to lose and everything to gain. The routine of an emperor's bodyguard was a mixture of boredom and constant vigilance. They accompanied the monarch to his religious ceremonies, where he knelt and prayed, while they, axes in hand, stood motionless, like stone statues. They accompanied him to his councils of war, where they remained silent, but with their eyes and ears alert for any sign of treason or conspiracy. Their presence was a constant reminder to the nobles and generals that any act of treason would be punished by death. The role of the personal bodyguards went beyond protecting the emperor's body. They also served as his eyes and ears. They listened to the whispers, gossip, and intrigues of the court and reported everything to the emperor. They were the informants, the spies, the only source of information the emperor could truly trust. Their presence in the palace chambers and on the city streets was a terror to the conspirators, who knew that any rash word could be overheard by a Varangian. The guards' loyalty was tested daily, but they never wavered. They were true to their oath, and their loyalty was a commodity more valuable than any gold. Their shadow was the shadow of the emperor, and their power was the power of the throne. They were not just guards. They were the embodiment of the emperor's authority and power, a constant reminder that the throne was inviolable. The loyalty of a Varangian was a commodity more valuable than any army, and Emperor Basil II knew it. The Varangian Guard's loyalty wasn't limited to protecting the emperor in combat. It extended to the most somber and unpopular duties at court. Emperor Basil II used his guards as his police and executioners, a swift-acting force that wouldn't hesitate to arrest conspiring nobles or carry out death sentences. It was a job that local guards, with their families and ties to the city, would hesitate to undertake. The Varangians, however, had no such constraints. They were foreigners, with no ties of blood or friendship to the capital. and their loyalty was solely to the emperor. The task of arresting a conspiratorial nobleman was delicate and dangerous. The nobles were powerful and wealthy, with their own guards and armies. But when the Varangian Guard knocked on their door, they knew the game was up. The Varangians were ruthless, and they cared nothing for the conspirators' status or wealth. They entered their homes, arrested them, and took them to prison without hesitation. Their presence was a symbol that the emperor was the law, and that no one, no matter how powerful, was above it. The darkest task, however, was carrying out death sentences. The execution of a nobleman was an act of power and terror, a warning to all who dared conspire against the throne. The Varangians were the emperor's executioners, and they carried out their duties without emotion or remorse. They were viewed with terror by the nobles, who knew they could not bribe them or appeal to their mercy. A Varangian's axe was the last thing a conspirator saw in his life, and it was proof that loyalty to the emperor was a more valuable asset than life itself. The Varangians' role as police and enforcers was crucial to the empire's stability. They ensured that the emperor's law was enforced and that order was maintained. They were the swift-acting force, stepping in when the local guards hesitated. They were proof that the emperor had control over his own state and did not rely on traitorous nobles and generals. The Varangian Guard's dark task was actually the light that kept the empire in order. Their presence was a constant reminder that the emperor was the power and that no one could challenge him without suffering the consequences. The Varangian Guard's unwavering loyalty and ferocity in combat stemmed not only from a sense of honor. They were reinforced by a material reward few warriors of their time could imagine. The gold of Byzantium was the engine that drove the Varangians. Emperor Basil II, and the emperors who followed him, paid his guards a regular and extravagant salary, a paycheck that was more than enough to support an entire family in Scandinavia. For the warriors who had grown up in the poverty and hardship of their homeland, the wealth of Constantinople was a dream come true. Payment was made in solid gold coins, the famous Byzantine solidus, which was the most valuable and stable currency in the world. The Varangians spent their wages with the same ferocity with which they fought. They purchased silk clothing, jewelry, high-quality weapons and armor, and lived in a luxury they could never have dreamed of in their homelands. They became one of the wealthiest classes in the city, and their wealth was a symbol of their status and importance. Gold was not just a reward, it was also a form of control. The emperor ensured that the Varangians remained faithful to the throne, because their wealth was directly tied to their loyalty. The emperor knew that for men who had fought all their lives for a small amount of silver and plunder, the promise of a life of luxury and wealth was a powerful motivator. "No man is more loyal than he who has much to lose," said one of the Byzantine officers, and he was right. The wealth of the Varangian Guard was proof that the emperor valued their loyalty and strength, and that he was willing to pay for it. The gold of Byzantium was the bond that bound the northern warriors to the empire. They fought for money, yes, but also for honor, and money was proof that their honor was valued. The wealth of the Varangian Guard was proof that they had achieved success, and that their journey south was not in vain. It was proof that the legend of Miklagard, the city paved with gold, was more than a legend. It was a reality they had conquered with their swords and their loyalty. Among the many legends surrounding the Varangian Guard, one stands out for its audacity and singularity: the Polutasvarf. This term, of Norse origin and lacking solid historical evidence, refers to a supposed legendary and unique right of the Guard to plunder the imperial treasury after the natural death of an emperor. This was not a chaotic and violent plunder like that of a conquering enemy, but rather a formalized ritual, a final reward for the unwavering loyalty demonstrated throughout the monarch's life. The popular narrative suggested that the Varangians could enter the treasury chamber and take whatever they could carry, an act that represented the greatest reward of all. This legend, though more folkloric than historically accurate, is revealing. It reflects the contemporary perception of the extraordinary trust the emperor placed in his foreign guards. If an emperor died of natural causes, a rare and desirable thing in Byzantium, it signified that his personal guard had performed their duty perfectly. The Polutasvarf would be the culmination of this service, the final payment for years of tedium and vigilance. It was recognition that, unlike the local nobles and generals who craved the throne, the Varangians wanted only one thing: their reward. The idea that a bodyguard unit could plunder the state treasury was unthinkable in any other court. It demonstrated the extreme and desperate situation of the empire, which needed a force so loyal they would be willing to accept this condition. The legend of the Palutusvarf also served as an incentive for the guard to keep the emperor alive and safe. After all, their reward would only come upon the monarch's natural death. Death by conspiracy or assassination would mean the end of the contract, and possibly their own lives. Although most modern historians doubt the literal practice of Palutusvarf, the legend itself is a testament to the unique and feared status of the Varangian Guard. It demonstrates that the relationship between the Byzantine emperor and his Norse guards was based on a logic that transcended protocol and local culture. It was a relationship of pragmatism, where loyalty was bought not only with gold and honor, but with the promise of a legendary reward that would transform the humblest soldier into an immensely wealthy man. It was the promise that, at the end of a tour of duty, there would be a pot of gold waiting for them. By the 11th century, the fame of the Varangian Guard had spread throughout Europe, reaching even the most distant kingdoms of Scandinavia. The legend of Miklagard and the gold of Byzantium was the dream of every young warrior, an invitation to glory and riches. It was against this backdrop that a young and ambitious Norwegian exile, Harald Sigurdsson, sought refuge and fortune in Constantinople. He was a man of royal blood who had lost the throne to his half-brother, and now, at just 15, saw his future in the hands of the legendary Varangian Guard. Harald Sigurdsson, who would later be known as Hardrada the Merciless, was no ordinary warrior. He was a man of ambition, intelligence, and unshakable willpower. He didn't just want the pay and luxury of the Guard, he wanted power, fame, and one day the throne he had lost. He joined the Guard with the intention of learning, mastering combat, and amassing a fortune that would help him regain what was rightfully his. His journey to Constantinople was the beginning of one of the most extraordinary and legendary careers in history. Harald quickly adapted to life in the Guard. He learned to fight with the Danish axe, to move in a phalanx, and to obey orders without question. He excelled in combat, and his ferocity and skill with the sword and axe were remarkable. He was not just a soldier, he was a born leader, and his ambition and vision for the future set him apart from the other Varangians. He saw the Guard not only as a source of income, but as a school, a place where he could learn about politics, strategy, and the world. He was a spy, an informant, and an advisor, and his influence in the Byzantine court grew rapidly. Harald Sigurdsson's arrival in the Varangian Guard marked the beginning of a new era. He was the first Varangian to become a leader of his own troop, and his rise to power in the Byzantine court was an unprecedented phenomenon. His journey to Constantinople was the first step on his path to becoming King of Norway, and his story is proof that the Varangian Guard was not only about gold and honor, it was also about glory and legend. His story is the hook for the next part of our narrative, the story of how a young exile became King of Norway, and how the Varangian Guard was the stage for his rise. Harald Sigurdsson's ambition wasn't limited to the walls of Constantinople. He knew that to amass the fame and wealth necessary to claim the Norwegian throne, he needed more than a guard's pay. His journey in the Varangian Guard was a series of military campaigns that took him to every corner of the Byzantine Empire in a relentless pursuit of glory and gold. His journey was a saga of combat, strategy, and success. Harald participated in military campaigns in Sicily, where he fought against the Arabs. He distinguished himself in combat, and his skill with the axe was fearsome. He was a strategist and a leader, and his reputation grew rapidly. He led troops, captured fortresses, and amassed a vast fortune in plunder and bounties. His Sicilian journey was a success, and he returned to Constantinople with more gold than he could have dreamed of in his homeland. He was then sent to fight in Bulgaria, where he led the Guard against rebel forces. He demonstrated great military skill and leadership. His journey to Bulgaria was a success, and he returned to Constantinople with more gold than he could have ever dreamed of in his homeland. His most notable journey, however, was to the Holy Land, where he fought against the Saracens. He distinguished himself again in combat, amassing fame and a vast personal fortune. His journey to the Holy Land was a success, and he returned to Constantinople with more gold than he could have ever dreamed of in his homeland. Harald Sigurdsson, the future Hardrada, became a hero, a man who had fought in every corner of the empire and amassed a vast personal fortune. He was no longer just a Varangian. He was a living legend, a man who had become rich and famous with his sword. His journey on military campaigns was the turning point in his life, the moment he realized that his ambition was greater than the pay and luxury of a guard. His journey in the Varangian Guard was the first step on his journey to becoming a king. Life in the Varangian Guard was a mixture of extremes: the tedium of routine, the fury of combat, and the opulence of court. Amidst this dichotomy, a small and remarkable act of humanity connects us to these warriors in a surprising way. In one of the upper galleries of the majestic Hagia Sophia in Constantinople, a Varangian, bored with the long and monotonous guard duty, decided to leave his mark. He took his weapon, or perhaps a stiletto, and carved a simple and direct message into the marble balustrade. Halfdan was here. This act, which may seem like a simple joke by a bored soldier, is actually an echo through the centuries, a testament to the existence and humanity of these warriors. The inscription, written in runes, was discovered and deciphered by historians, and is one of the few physical proofs of the presence of Norse warriors in Constantinople. The marble balustrade, which had witnessed centuries of religious ceremonies and court intrigue, now bore the mark of a man who felt the same boredom and monotony as any soldier in any period in history. The inscription is a window into the past, proof that the Varangians were not just fighting machines, but men of flesh and blood, with their own emotions, their own thoughts, and their own desires. Halfdan's inscription is a reminder that, even amidst a life of discipline and luxury, humanity manifests itself in unexpected ways. Halfdan's act, which may have been a simple joke, is actually a cry for existence, a desire to be remembered. He wanted his presence, his story, and his life to have meaning, a purpose. His inscription on the balustrade of Hagia Sophia is proof that he existed, that he was there, that he was part of history. Halfdan's inscription stands in stark contrast to the grandeur and opulence of Hagia Sophia. It is proof that, even amidst a life of wealth and power, humanity manifests itself simply and directly. It echoes through the centuries, proving that history is not just about kings and generals, but also about ordinary men, with their own fears, dreams, and hopes. Halfdan's inscription is proof that history is, ultimately, about us. The Varangian Guard was designed to be immune to the complex and deadly conspiracies of the Byzantine court. Their loyalty was bought and sworn, their culture foreign, and their interests simple. But even the most disciplined and honorable warriors were not completely safe from the poison of intrigue. The court of Constantinople was a swamp of treachery, and the Guard's loyalty was constantly tested. They were the target of bribes, promises of power, and threats. The conspiring noblewomen and generals tried every way to break their loyalty. The Varangians, with their impetuous nature and pride, were an easy target for the conspirators. They didn't understand the complex rules of Byzantine politics, and their innocence was a weakness the conspirators sought to exploit. They were the weakest link in the emperor's security chain. But what the conspirators didn't understand was that a Varangian's loyalty was not based on a code of law, but on a code of honor. They were loyal to their oath, and they wouldn't break it for money or power. The story of the Varangian Guard is one of resistance. They resisted every temptation and every threat. They arrested and executed noble conspirators without hesitation. They cared nothing for the conspirators' status or wealth. They cared only for the oath they had sworn to the emperor. Their loyalty was the only thing that distinguished them from the local guards, and it was the only thing that protected them from intrigue. Their resistance to the plot was proof that the emperor had made the right choice in trusting them with his life. The Varangian Guard's immunity to intrigue was a myth. They weren't immune. They were simply stronger. They resisted temptations and threats, and they maintained their loyalty, even when their lives were at risk. Their resistance was a constant reminder that the empire, with all its wealth and glory, depended on the loyalty of a group of foreigners. Their resistance was proof that honor and loyalty were more important than money and power. And their resistance was proof that the Varangian Guard was more than a fighting unit. It was a symbol of honor and loyalty. The Varangian Guard's presence in Constantinople was an anomaly, a foreign force in a city that considered itself the center of the civilized world. The local population and the Byzantine elite's perception of the Guard was a complex and contradictory mix of emotions. They called them axe-carrying barbarians, a term that carried a mixture of fear, contempt, and grudging respect. Fear was the strongest emotion. The Varangians were tall, strong, and bearded, and their ferocity in combat was legendary. The sound of their axes and the sight of their armor were enough to terrify anyone. They were the emperor's executioners, and no one in Constantinople dared defy them. Fear was the emperor's tool to maintain order and discipline in his city. The Varangians' presence on the streets was a constant reminder that the emperor's law was the law. Contempt was the most subtle emotion. The Byzantines considered themselves superior to all other peoples and viewed the Varangians as barbarians, men without culture, civilization, or morals. They accused them of stealing, drinking, and fighting, and saw their presence at court as a stain on the empire's honor. Contempt was the Byzantines' way of dealing with the reality that their empire, the most powerful and richest in the world, depended on the strength of a group of foreigners. Grudging respect was the most intriguing emotion. The Byzantines, masters of politics and strategy, knew the loyalty of the Varangian Guard was priceless. They had seen the Varangians in combat and witnessed their strength and ferocity. They knew the Varangians were the only men the emperor could truly trust. Grudging respect was proof that the Byzantine elite, however much they despised them, knew their very existence depended on the Guard's loyalty. The perception of the Varangian Guard by the local population and the Byzantine elite was a testament to the complexity of the relationship between the emperor and his guards. Their loyalty was a commodity more valuable than gold, and their presence in Constantinople was a constant reminder that the empire, for all its glory and wealth, was vulnerable, and that its survival depended on the strength and loyalty of a group of axe-wielding barbarians. The Varangian Guard's loyalty wasn't limited to the walls of Constantinople. They were also the emperor's shock force, his spear, which he used to face the most formidable enemies on the empire's borders. They were the elite troops sent to the most dangerous areas, to fight in enemy territory, where life was brutal and death was a constant. The Varangian Guard fought in every corner of the empire, on military campaigns that took them to distant and dangerous places. They fought against the Pechenegs, a nomadic horse-riding people who terrorized the empire's borders. The Varangians, with their heavy axes and combat discipline, were the only force that could stand against the knights. They also fought against the Seljuk Turks, a rising, warlike people who threatened the empire. The Varangians, with their strength and skill in combat, were the only force that could stand against the Turks. They were the shock force the emperor used to confront the most dangerous enemies, his last line of defense. The Varangian Guard's role in enemy territory was crucial to the empire's security. They ensured the borders were secure and the empire protected from invasion. They were the rapid-fire force that acted when local armies hesitated. They were proof that the emperor had control over his own state and did not rely on traitorous generals. A Varangian's journey into enemy territory was a life of danger and uncertainty. They fought in strange lands, against unknown enemies, but their loyalty and discipline in combat made them invincible. They were the emperor's war dogs. His shock force and their presence in enemy territory was a constant reminder that the emperor's law was law. Their journey was proof that honor and loyalty are more important than money and power. And their journey is proof that the Varangian Guard was more than a fighting unit. It was a symbol of strength and loyalty. The ambition of Harald Sigurdsson, the future Hardrada, was not limited to Constantinople. He knew that to claim the Norwegian throne, which he had lost to his half-brother, he needed more than the pay and luxury of a guard. His time in the Varangian Guard was a school, a place where he learned about politics, strategy, and the world. He amassed fame, wealth, and a vast personal fortune. But the time came to leave. Harald, who had become a leader and commander, decided it was time to return to Norway. But his ambition and fame had placed him in a dangerous position. The Byzantine Empress, Zoe Porphyrogenita, who had assumed the throne, viewed Harold with a mixture of admiration and distrust. She saw him as a threat, a man more popular than the emperor and possessing a dangerous ambition. She had him arrested and thrown into prison, an act of jealousy and fear. Imprisonment, however, was not the end of Harold's journey. With the help of his loyal companions, he escaped. His escape from Hardrada of Constantinople was a legendary event, an act of daring and courage that became a saga in itself. He and his companions disguised themselves as monks and managed to escape from prison. They stole a boat and fled to Russia, an act of desperation and daring. His escape from Constantinople was the turning point in his life, the moment he realized that his ambition was greater than the pay and luxury of a guard. Harold, the future Hardrada, returned to Norway, where he used his fame, wealth, and experience to claim the throne. He became King of Norway, and his journey home was the beginning of a new saga. His escape from Constantinople is proof that the Varangian Guard was more than a fighting unit. It was a school, a place where men could learn, grow, and become legends. And his escape is proof that ambition and courage are more important than fear and submission. The year 1066 marked a turning point in the history of the Varangian Guard. The Norman conquest of England, led by William the Conqueror, resulted in a mass migration of dispossessed Anglo-Saxon warriors. Having lost their lands and fortunes, they saw in Constantinople a new lease on life, a new opportunity to become wealthy and exact revenge on the Normans. Their arrival in Constantinople forever changed the composition and dynamics of the Varangian Guard. The Anglo-Saxons were elite warriors, with a long tradition of combat and honor. They brought a new mentality, a new form of combat, and a new dynamic to the Varangian Guard. They were men who had lost everything and harbored a deep hatred for the Normans. They were the shock force the emperor needed to confront the empire's new enemies. The arrival of the Anglo-Saxons resulted in a change in the composition of the Guard. Most of the Varangians, who were Norse, were replaced by Anglo-Saxon warriors. The culture and language of the Guard changed, and its internal dynamics were transformed. The Anglo-Saxons brought new combat tactics to the Guard, such as shield formation, a tactic they had perfected in battles against the Normans. They were a shock force. The arrival of the Anglo-Saxons in the Varangian Guard marked the beginning of a new era. The Guard, formerly a Nordic unit, was now a melting pot of cultures, an elite force composed of warriors from all corners of the world. Its new composition proved that the Varangian Guard was more than a combat unit. It was a symbol of resistance, honor, and loyalty. Its new internal dynamics proved that the Varangian Guard was more than a mercenary unit. It was a brotherhood of warriors who fought for honor and for their brothers. The arrival of the Anglo-Saxons was the beginning of a new saga for the Varangian Guard. Their journey to Constantinople was the first step on their path to becoming a living legend. Their arrival is proof that history is not just about kings and generals, but also about ordinary men, with their own fears, dreams, and hopes. The mass arrival of Anglo-Saxon warriors in the Varangian Guard after the Norman conquest of 1066 brought more than new combat tactics. It also generated an inevitable clash of cultures. Although both groups shared a Germanic heritage and a warrior tradition, differences in language, customs, and above all, pride, quickly manifested in internal tensions and rivalries. What was once a cohesive brotherhood of Norsemen now became a testing ground for the coexistence of two distinct identities. The Old Norse members, who had served the emperor for decades, viewed the newcomers with suspicion. They were the masters of the house, the founders of the Guard's legend, and considered their loyalty and ferocity superior. They spoke a language the Anglo-Saxons barely understood and maintained their own rituals and songs. To them, the Anglo-Saxons seemed desperate, men who had lost their land and sought refuge in a place the Norse had conquered with their own strength and honor. The Anglo-Saxons, for their part, carried with them a deep sense of loss and a latent hatred for the Normans. They had fought in one of the bloodiest battles in history, the Battle of Hastings, and their combat experience was unparalleled. They saw the Norse as men who had become comfortable with the luxury and boredom of Constantinople, and who had lost the ferocity of their ancestors. "We did not come here for gold," said one of the Anglo-Saxons. "We came here for revenge and a new lease on life." Rivalries manifested themselves in fights, contests of strength, and games of chance. Clashes were frequent, but never escalated to lethal violence because discipline and loyalty to the Guard were stronger than any rivalry. The wisdom of the Guard's leaders, a mix of Norse and Anglo-Saxon, was key to the unit's survival. They knew that the Guard's strength lay not in its homogeneity, but in its diversity. They used rivalry to strengthen the Guard, to create healthy competition, so that both groups became stronger and more skilled in combat. The clash of cultures was a test of the Varangian Guard's resilience. It proved that the Guard was more than a mercenary unit. It was a brotherhood of warriors who fought for honor and for their brothers, regardless of their origins. Their ability to adapt and unite in the face of adversity was proof that the Varangian Guard was a living legend, a symbol of strength, honor, and loyalty. The 13th century marked the beginning of the end for the Varangian Guard, and their journey reached its most tragic and ironic point in the Fourth Crusade of 1204. The Crusaders, sworn to fight for the Holy Land, were diverted from their course by political intrigue. They allied with a pretender to the Byzantine throne and decided that the richest city in the world, Constantinople, was a more attractive target than Jerusalem. The Varangian Guard, sworn to defend the throne and the city, found themselves in a moral and spiritual dilemma. They were not fighting Muslims or pagans, but rather Christian knights from the West. The Varangian Guard, which had previously defended the empire from enemies from every corner of the world, now found itself in an unprecedented situation. They were fighting against their brothers in faith, against men who spoke a similar language, and whose cultural heritage was closer to their own than that of the Byzantines. It was a battle of loyalty, honor, and faith. The Varangian Guard, axes in hand, fought with the same ferocity they had used in combat, but their fury was sadder, more melancholy. They were fighting to protect the empire, but their souls were conflicted. The Varangian Guard's defense of Constantinople was an act of heroism and desperation. They fought at every gate and on every wall. "They fought like lions," wrote one of the Crusaders. Their struggle, however, was in vain. The empire, which was in political and economic crisis, lacked the strength to resist the attack. The city was sacked, and the Byzantine Empire, the most powerful and richest in the world, was divided among the Crusaders. The Fourth Crusade of 1204 was a turning point for the Varangian Guard. Their loyalty had been tested to the limit, and they had failed. They failed not for lack of courage or strength. They failed because the empire they had sworn to protect had become an empire of ruins. The sack of Constantinople was the end of an era, the end of the Byzantine Empire, and the end of the Varangian Guard as the empire's elite force. Their journey to Constantinople was the beginning of a new saga, the saga of an empire in ruins and a guard in fragments. The sack of Constantinople by the Crusaders in 1204 was not just a military event, it was a humanitarian catastrophe. The city, once the center of the civilized world, was sacked with a brutality that shocked even the most seasoned warriors. The Crusaders, sworn to fight for the Holy Land, looted churches, killed innocents, and destroyed works of art. The Varangian Guard, sworn to defend the city, found itself in a desperate situation. They were not fighting to win, they were fighting to survive. The Varangian Guard's last stand was an act of heroism and desperation. They rallied around the emperor and fought with a ferocity that surpassed the fury of the Crusaders. They formed a circle of shields around the monarch and fought with their axes drawn, as one body. They fought like lions among hungry wolves, wrote a chronicler. Their struggle, however, was in vain. The emperor was killed in combat, and his death signaled the end. The emperor's death marked the end of the Varangian Guard as the empire's elite force. Their loyalty had been tested to the limit, and they had kept their oath. They fought to the last man, and their resistance was a constant reminder that honor and loyalty are more important than life itself. Their struggle was an act of heroism, but also an act of tragedy. They fought to protect the empire, but the empire lay in ruins. The sack of Constantinople marked the end of an era, the end of the Byzantine Empire, and the end of the Varangian Guard as the empire's elite force. Their last stand was an act of heroism, but also an act of desperation. They fought to protect the empire, but the empire lay in ruins. Their struggle was the final act in a saga that had begun with the promise of gold and honor, and ended with the promise of death and glory. The sack of Constantinople in 1204 not only ended the era of the Varangian Guard as we knew it, but also disbanded it. The once cohesive and feared elite corps fragmented, with its remnants finding themselves in an unusual situation, serving an empire in ruins. Far from disappearing, the Guard adapted. The story of the Guard after the fall of Constantinople is one of a struggle for survival and loyalty to an empire that no longer existed in its original form. Many of the surviving Varangians joined one of the successor states that emerged from the collapse of the Byzantine Empire, the Empire of Nicaea. The Nicaean emperors, who kept the flame of the empire alive, needed an elite force to protect them from internal and external enemies. The Varangians, with their reputation for loyalty and ferocity, were the obvious choice. Their presence in exile was a symbol that the empire, in all its glory, still existed. The Guard's life in Nicaea was a shadow of its life in Constantinople. The wealth and opulence of Byzantium had disappeared, and the Varangians lived in relative poverty. But their loyalty and discipline in combat had not vanished. They continued to serve the emperor with the same honor and ferocity. Their struggle in Nicaea was a struggle to keep the flame of the empire alive, a struggle to restore the glory that had been lost. The fragmentation of the Varangian Guard is a reminder that history is not only about great empires, but also about the struggle for survival and loyalty. Their journey to Nicaea was proof that honor and loyalty are more important than money and power. And their journey is proof that the Varangian Guard was more than a unit of mercenaries. It was a brotherhood of warriors who fought for honor and for their brothers. The fragmentation of the Varangian Guard after the sack of Constantinople in 1204 not only dispersed it, but also initiated a process of dilution of its identity. The unit, which had previously been a brotherhood of Norse warriors with their own traditions, language, and sagas, began to lose its cohesion. The number of Norsemen in the Guard dwindled dramatically, and its composition changed to include warriors from all over the world. The Guard, once an elite force with a unique identity, was now just another unit of foreign mercenaries. The traditions and the Norse language that were the foundation of the Guard's identity began to disappear. The new recruits, who were Anglo-Saxons, English, and others, did not speak Norse, and the sagas and songs that were the soul of the Guard were forgotten. The Danish axe, the symbol of the Guard, was replaced by other weapons, and its ferocity in combat was forgotten. The Varangian Guard, once the most feared and respected force in the empire, was now merely a fighting unit, devoid of its unique identity. The dilution of the Varangian Guard's identity is a reminder that culture and tradition are fragile. Their identity, forged through years of boredom and combat, was lost in just a few decades. Their story, once a saga of glory and honor, was now one of loss and oblivion. Their journey is proof that history is not only about victories and defeats, but also about the struggle to maintain identity. The Varangian Guard's loss of identity is a tragic event. Their history, once a saga of glory and honor, was now one of loss and oblivion. Their journey is proof that history is not only about great empires, but also about the struggle to maintain identity. And their journey is proof that the Varangian Guard was more than a mercenary unit. It was a brotherhood of warriors who fought for honor and for their brothers. After centuries of glory, the history of the Varangian Guard ends with a final melancholic account. The final record of the Varangian Guard in action, a moment that marks the end of an era. The last mention of the Guard is of a small group of warriors fighting to defend the empire from an unknown enemy. They were the last remnant of a force that had been the most feared and respected in the entire empire. The last historical mention of the Varangian Guard is of a small group of warriors who fought to defend the empire from an unknown enemy. They were the last remnant of a force that had been the most feared and respected in the entire empire. Their struggle, however, was in vain. Their story, once a saga of glory and honor, was now one of loss and oblivion. Their struggle is proof that history is not only about great empires, but also about the struggle for survival and loyalty. Their journey is proof that honor and loyalty are more important than money and power. And their journey is proof that the Varangian Guard was more than a mercenary unit. It was a brotherhood of warriors who fought for honor and for their brothers. The last historical mention of the Varangian Guard is a reminder that history is not only about victories and defeats, but also about heroism and sacrifice. Their struggle is proof that honor and loyalty are more important than money and power. And their struggle is proof that the Varangian Guard was more than a mercenary unit. It was a brotherhood of warriors who fought for honor and for their brothers. Among the few Varangians who survived centuries of service and the challenges of the Byzantine Empire, one of the most fascinating stories is that of the return of the Varangian. The legendary tale of a warrior who, after decades in Constantinople, returns to his native Scandinavia. Immensely wealthy but forever transformed by his experiences in the south. He was no longer the same young man who had set out in search of fortune. He was a man of the world, with a different code of honor and a worldview that contrasted with the simplicity of his homeland. The returned Varangian was a man of wealth. He brought with him solid gold coins, jewels, and silk clothes that set him apart from the others. He lived in a luxurious home, with servants and all the comforts his wealth could buy. He was a man of power, and his wealth and fame were proof that his journey south was not in vain. He was a successful man, and his story was proof that the legend of Miklagard was real. His story, however, was not only one of success, it was also one of transformation. The returned Varangian was a man who had adapted to a new culture, a new language, and a new world. He had lost his sense of identity, and his life in Constantinople was a constant reminder that his life in his homeland had become a shadow. The story of the Varangian return is a reminder that experience and transformation are more important than money and power. His journey is proof that history is not just about great empires, but also about the struggle to maintain identity. And his journey is proof that the Varangian Guard was more than a mercenary unit. It was a brotherhood of warriors who fought for honor and for their brothers. And his story is proof that history is ultimately about us. One of the most moving and tangible proofs of the Varangians' journey to Constantinople are the runestones of Greece. Scattered primarily throughout Sweden, these memorial stones were erected by families in honor of their sons, brothers, and husbands who died in the service of the Byzantine emperor in the land of the Greeks. The inscriptions, engraved in runes, tell short, melancholy stories of men who set out in search of fortune and never returned home. The runestones are a silent and powerful record of an age of adventure and sacrifice. They mention men who died in the East, who departed for Greece, and who are buried in Byzantium. The inscriptions are a constant reminder that the journey to Miklagard was perilous, and that many who set out to seek their fortune never returned home. The stones echo through the centuries, proof that history is not only about victories and defeats, but also about mourning and memory. The runestones of Greece are a contrast to the grandeur and opulence of Constantinople. They are proof that the legend of Miklagard was more than just a legend. It was a reality that many paid for with their lives. They are a reminder that history is about flesh and blood men, with their own families, their own dreams, and their own hopes. The stones are proof that history is ultimately about us. The Greece runestones are the last and most poignant proof of the Varangian Guard's existence. They are a reminder that history is not only about great empires, but also about the struggle for survival and loyalty. Their journey is proof that honor and loyalty are more important than money and power. And their journey is proof that the Varangian Guard was more than a mercenary unit. It was a brotherhood of warriors who fought for honor and for their brothers. The gradual disappearance of the Varangian Guard marked the end of an era, and the scenario that followed reflects the legacy of its existence. The post-Varangian landscape is a world of uncertainty, fragility, and change. The Byzantine Empire, which had depended on the strength and loyalty of the Guard for centuries, was terminally weakened. It had lost its military strength, its cohesion, and its identity, and now it fought for its survival. Its fall, which would become a reality in the 15th century, was only a matter of time. Scandinavia, the Varangian homeland, had also changed. The Viking Age had come to an end, and the Norse kingdoms, once a collection of warrior jarls and kings, were now consolidated into Christian kingdoms. The path east once a route of adventure and plunder, was now a route of trade and diplomacy. The warriors who had set out in search of gold and glory were now men who devoted themselves to farming, fishing, and trade. The legend of Miklagard, once the dream of every young warrior, was now just a story, a memory of an era that had come to an end. The end of the Varangian Guard is a reminder that history is cyclical, and that great empires and great legends eventually come to an end. Their story, however, is a reminder that the legacy of an era is not just about victories and defeats, but about its impact on history and culture. The legacy of the Varangian Guard is one of honor, loyalty, and sacrifice, a legacy that has inspired the imagination of poets, chroniclers, and historians for centuries. Their story is a reminder that history is, ultimately, about us. Their saga, the saga of the Northern Warrior and Miklagard, is proof that history is the greatest and most epic of all stories.